while Trump talks about ideological balance and demands it from the institutions in his warnings to them, the agreements don't cover it. And the reason why the agreements don't cover it is they can't. Because there is no civil rights violation in ideological imbalance. As it turns out, universities are allowed to be imbalanced. It's bad practice, but there really aren't convenient legal tools for the government to force the change. And the universities themselves don't have the will. So the only way, I believe, to get ideological balance in higher ed is for competition from newly formed universities.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hello, this is David Bernstein, host of The Contrarian podcast. I have a special guest with me, someone I've known for a while, whose work I've admired, P Greene. Jay is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation who specializes in education. He spent years at the University of Arkansas. I think you even headed the department, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, of education. And you've been a compelling conservative voice who I think has done some really groundbreaking research, looking at, the role of DEI and DEI heads at universities and how that politicized their views. And I've always admired that and your willingness to take on issues that maybe others have been ignoring. So it's great to have you back on.
Well, thanks for having me on.
So let's start with, a lot of your work is in higher education. I think probably the last time we spoke, it was before the Trump administration had entered the scene. There's been a lot of changes. And what do you make of those changes? The policy shifts, the executive orders, the focusing on, universities like Harvard. What do you think how would you describe them?
I think overall it's been a very positive development in reforming higher education. And I'm not sure I could defend every detail and every procedure, but the general thrust of the Trump administration's efforts have been spot on. They've targeted the right institutions, they've gone after the right issues, and they're asking for, in the end, very reasonable solutions. I mean, if you look at the agreements that have been struck with Columbia, Penn, and Brown, there is nothing in them that interferes with academic freedom at all, nothing that inappropriately infringes upon institutional autonomy. So all of the ghost stories that academics and their friends like to tell each other about the Trump takeover of higher education, none of that has turned out to be true. And even the district court decision yesterday or 2 days ago on Harvard's case, I think is not going to be a bump in their road at putting significant pressure on these institutions to make meaningful reform.
Yeah. So the case against it sometimes has to do with going after medical research, for example, and compromising medical research and putting our public health at risk and the like. What do you make of all of that?
So, in general, this is not a good look for higher education to say that unless you allow us to continue to discriminate, we won't cure cancer. This is not a very compelling argument. The truth is that the government does fund a lot of research. Some of it is important for saving lives. A lot of it isn't. So let's not assume that every dollar that these institutions get is for life-saving research.
Yeah, but some of the money that is being put in jeopardy is money specifically dedicated to medical research, right?
Right. Well, and these institutions have their own resources and their own obligations to engage in this research. I mean, they are nonprofit institutions committed to research that raise significant private funds for this purpose. And so they're not lacking for money to do essential life-saving research. They have plenty. What they can't do is engage in significant gross civil rights violations and still be entitled to taxpayer dollars. So all of the money that these institutions get is conditioned on compliance with civil rights law. They're not entitled to that money. There are conditions that come with it. And so the same could be said of, I don't know, Little Rock public schools in the 1950s. They're doing essential work to educate the youth. How dare you threaten their funding? Well, as it turns out, funding is contingent upon compliance with civil rights. And so because these institutions do want the funding, they will get into compliance. And we're already seeing very significant changes in that direction.
Yeah. The other criticism that you hear is that we're replacing one radical ideology with another form of illiberal ideology. That what they're trying to actually do, say the critics, is they're trying to fundamentally change the university's ideology, not to classical liberalism, as people like me would certainly like to see, but to, whatever conservative political worldview that they're secretly trying to install. What do you make of that?
So first, it's really important for people to look at the actual agreements, because none of these scary stories that people like to tell each other about Trump's takeover and installing his own ideology in place of whatever existing ideology dominates college campuses, none of that is in the agreements. Nothing like that. I mean, the agreements are basically promises by the institutions not to engage in civil rights violations, agreements to independent monitoring of that promise, and changes to disciplinary processes, mostly centralizing disciplinary processes, in order to make sure that radical and well-organized groups of faculty don't hijack student discipline for the purposes of allowing rule-breaking students who do infringe on civil rights to go unpunished, right? So all of these are very sensible reforms, and frankly, they're reforms that trustees have long wanted to do. The things that Trump is actually getting changed are things that are not only sensible, but things that the senior leadership of universities have long dreamed of, but been unable to do, because they have faced organized resistance from radical groups of faculty who have hijacked their campuses. And so ironically, Trump is helping senior leadership regain control of their universities and make their institutions reasonable places, sensible places that can follow civil rights law. And none of this infringes on academic freedom. None of it installs a right-wing ideology in place of any other ideology. While Trump talks about, the need for these institutions to restore ideological balance, and I think that is a good thing that they should do. I think diverse perspectives are a healthy thing in higher education, but in the actual agreements, there's nothing in there about it.
Yeah. So let's go to the actual agreements for a second. A few weeks ago, I looked at the Columbia agreement, and, there's an argument that it's a kind of compensatory affirmative action for Jews, that it's funding Jewish institutions like Hillel and the like, that that it actually amounts to a kind of Jewish DEI program to make up for the discriminatory trends and conduct and hostile environment that Jews have faced on campus, and that therefore what it's not doing is restoring the sort of the foundational liberalism of the school that will ultimately do more to protect Jewish students than anything else. What do you make of that critique? Maybe coming even from some voices on the right.
Sure, I think it's gross misreading of those agreements. There is $21 million in the agreement for damages, but those are for students who were specifically and faculty and staff who were specifically damaged. It's not generically for Jews writ large, where everyone gets a share of the Columbia reparations.
Right.
That's not what the 21 million is for. It's for damages that the institution has imposed on its students, faculty, and staff. And I'm all for, and I think classical liberals should be all for the tort as a very sensible regulatory mechanism. What it does is it forces people to behave properly by making them pay for damages that they inflict on others. There's no special compensation for Jews beyond repaying damages, and there is no promise going forward of any special treatment for Jews. There's simply equal treatment for Jews, by which they promise not to have a disciplinary process that lets go the people who harass Jews, assault Jews, block Jews from crossing campus, going to their classes, going to their dorms. These are the kinds of things that are not covered by free speech. They are not speech. They are infringements on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm. So let's say for a second that this continues to succeed. He has a couple years to implement. You have several. He's able to go after several universities that were some of the most obvious offenders. And I think the theory of change, to use a nonprofit management term, is that this will lead to other universities outside the most elite, or maybe even second-tier universities right below the Ivies, to start to reform themselves because it's a deterrent. They're worried they could be next. The question is not just do we hope that happens, because I think the answer would be you want that to happen. The question is, will it happen? And is there evidence that it's happening now?
It's already happening. I'm hearing it from colleagues and former colleagues who are still in universities, that they're getting lots of memos from the university lawyers about practices that they used to commonly engage in for admissions and hiring that they are being warned not to do. And I have to tell you, from 16 years as a department head at a university, and from both what I saw personally and what I heard from colleagues all around the country, is that racial and sex discrimination in admissions and hiring was pervasive. I mean, it was so
no doubt
deeply entrenched that, honestly, I mean, as much as I was personally opposed to it, there was nothing I could do about it. I had to go along with these practices to survive. And it's so deeply entrenched that a lot of people feel righteous about it. And so it's going to take a little bit of time and some force from the government to put an end to these practices and to prevent the use of proxies to circumvent prohibitions. But I think they're already making progress in that direction. So I am very hopeful about changes that are going to come in ending discriminatory practices in admissions and hiring. What I'm less optimistic about is introducing ideological balance in higher education.
Yeah, because just look at the numbers. I mean, of professors and their ideological orientations, and there's extensive research on that.
The problem has so many different layers of gatekeeping that maintain it. And the government lacks enforcement tools to alter it. So while Trump talks about ideological balance and demands it from the institutions in his warnings to them, the agreements don't cover it. And the reason why the agreements don't cover it is they can't, because there is no civil rights violation in ideological imbalance. As it turns out, universities are allowed to be imbalanced. It's bad practice. It could lead to civil rights violations down the road if you're imbalanced because you don't check yourself in abusive practice. But there really aren't convenient legal tools for the government to force the change, and the universities themselves don't have the will. So the only way, I believe, to get ideological balance in higher ed is competition from newly formed universities. I know that sounds crazy.
But what about the Centers for Civic Thought that you see about 10 to 15 universities around the United States that are in formation or already up and running, really, that really do provide a kind of classical liberal education and become like a oasis within the university?
Sure. So this is what's called the Beachhead strategy. To create beachheads and campuses, and it's not new, actually. This has been tried for decades at universities and has repeatedly failed. Now, I know there's a new wave of beachheads that have been created in the last year or two, and perhaps this new effort will turn out differently than past ones.
Maybe the politics are starting to change and may make it harder for universities to gobble them up and turn them into, just another form of ideological homogeneity.
So, I was the head of a beachhead, right? So I was part of that effort. My department, the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas, was created as like a beachhead for this very purpose of introducing some ideological balance and, research quality in an ed school. And so to survive, I quickly learned that I had to promise never to leave the beach. You never leave the beach, because if you touch anything else at the university, you attract enemies. And they have tons of tools to kill you or neuter you. And so you avoid that by swearing repeatedly that you will not do anything outside of your very narrow beach and stick only to it. So you have no ability to transform the institution broadly.
But can it still? Can it still work in another way, though? In other words, you establish the beachhead, you start attracting better, smarter faculty. Presumably, you get better, smarter students who want to attend your program,
right?
And all of a sudden, you start to eclipse. Maybe even in a brand way,
right? So that all the students move to the beach
program at the university.
That's how you take over the institution.
Yes, or a higher, you get your fair share or a higher percentage, and the university starts to say, "Wait a second, this is working out for us. We should do more of that."
Nonprofits are not optimizing institutions, and so even things that seem like they would be good business practice. As it's long been good business practice for them to be ideologically diverse. They would attract more high quality students. They would attract more money from donors, but they're hijacking the institutions for private agendas, which nonprofit staff will do and get away with as much as they can. And so they won't necessarily recognize the success of these things and be impressed by it and wish to expand it. We have the example of just recently of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa, which was doing phenomenally well, attracting students, attracting donors. But a new president came in, didn't like it, got rid of it, got rid of the leader, basically destroyed it. And so what happens is that eventually there's a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph. They forget. The leaders who thought it was a good idea to create your beachhead and to start your experiment, they go away over time. And new leaders come in, and they have different agendas. And those agendas often involve looking at the resources the beachhead has with envy and wishing to take them for themselves. So what happens over time is you never leave the beach. They recapture the beach and steal your ammo. And so I'm not saying that, I'm certain that none of these new centers will thrive. I'm just saying the track record over decades has been terrible. Okay, terrible.
It's such an interesting perspective, because I've, for the last 2 years, been asking this question to various people like Steven Pinker and other high level people, and they all like it.
Of course,
you're the only second person,
because it's money for them. That's why they like it.
But no, I'm talking people who are very concerned about the state of the academy. These are people who are critics of the academy, and they all love this, except you and Greg Lukianoff are the only people I've spoken to who are suspicious of this. And it looks like you've had personal experience with it, and and have earned your position the hard way.
Right. Well, so we have a historical, not just the experience with beachheads over the last several decades, but we actually have a long, long history of reform in higher education that goes back to the 19th century. So in the 19th century, American universities weren't very good. They were basically ministerial training schools, and they were lousy in the sciences. And as the industrial age came, wealthy industrialists of the late 19th century looked at American universities and saw them as inadequate. And importantly, the thing they didn't do was give money to those institutions to build science labs. They did not, Rockefeller and Carnegie and Stanford did not give money to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and saying, well, you're kind of lousy in the sciences. We want to fund your sciences to improve you, to build a beachhead of the sciences in your ministerial training school. What they did was they built new universities, lots of them. John D. Rockefeller himself established at least 3 new universities.
So Jay, you're skeptical of the Centers for Civic Thought, this beachhead strategy, but you are favorably inclined toward the idea of new universities like the UATX, like University of Austin, Texas. But it seems to me that would be an enormously hard thing to scale. I mean, it's a very expensive proposition. How is that going to be a solution to the ideological balance problem?
So we actually did this once before in the history of higher education in America. So as I was saying, rather than giving money to Harvard, Princeton, and Yale to build science labs for them, these wealthy industrialists of the late 19th century built new universities that were built on a scientific model, imitating German scientific universities, that competed with Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, and made those universities better. And so during that time, people like John D. Rockefeller built 3 new universities: University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and Spelman. Other industrialists built Stanford, built Carnegie Mellon, built Johns Hopkins, built Vanderbilt. All of these were new institutions built on German scientific models to compete with the older ministerial training schools and helped reform higher education. And to put the financial burden in perspective, John D. Rockefeller, who started 3 universities, if you adjusted his peak wealth into current dollars, it would make him the 34th richest person in the US today. So there are 33 people richer than Rockefeller. And if each of them built 3 universities on the scale of the University of Chicago or Rockefeller University, we'd have a remarkable diversity of perspectives and healthy competition in the higher education space. But for some reason, the billionaires of today, the super rich of today, are very uninterested in this kind of meaningful reform. Instead, they devote their money to socially acceptable but basically non-disruptive activities. The Walton Family Foundation, which played a role in helping set up my beachhead before ultimately turning on it, their main legacy at present is building bike trails. And so, imagine, what your legacy is 100 years from now. Looking back, what will people say about the Waltons or about Bill Gates? Pouring money into Common Core, lots of things that popular but not actually very effective, when he could build new institutions. If he's really interested in health science research, he could build new universities to engage in that scientific research and do it more effectively. But instead he gives to inefficiently run, ideologically imbalanced existing institutions because he gets more praise for it. And so I'm very disappointed in our billionaires. I think we deserve better billionaires behaving better. And I think history in the future will judge them accordingly.
Yeah, and you have some of them who are funders of the opposite ideological, the framework that are actually part of the problem too.
Well, we also have strategic foreign donors playing roles in ideological imbalance on campus. I mean, we have the Confucius Institutes making Chinese inroads in higher education, and we have the Qataris engaged in a significant effort at present. And it's a shame that American super rich folks are not as interested in building new institutions for that would facilitate real ideological heterogeneity and real high quality and competition.
Yeah. So you've spent a lot of time looking at DEI, particularly in university settings. DEI seems to be on the ropes. What's your take? Where are we with DEI on campus now?
I think it's collapsing. There's been enormous progress in dismantling the DEI bureaucracies that were dramatically built up over the last decade or two. And I think part of how it could collapse so quickly is that actually these things were really unpopular. As it turns out, the vast majority of people on campus, students, faculty, are not radicals. They're decent, hardworking people who just want to get a quality education or engage in meaningful research. And yet universities get hijacked by well-organized but noisy and threatening groups of faculty and students. And DEI was one of these crazy ideologies that basically extorted senior leadership of universities with accusations that they'd be denounced as racist or be unable to get better jobs at other institutions unless they appeased these radicals by expanding and building ever more DEI bureaucracy and entrenching the ideology of those bureaucracies in the institutions. But no one liked this extortion. And once someone stood up to that bullying, the whole thing collapsed pretty quickly. Now, there are a few places where they have tried to rebrand DEI, under some
belonging or something. Yeah.
Right. The Loving Center or some, whatever new BS they have. But the truth is they don't have the political momentum anymore, and they don't have the ability to intimidate senior leadership in the way that they did in the past. And so
it turns out that some of the people who pretended to like DEI really didn't like DEI. And as soon as you change the dynamics.
Well, like Malcolm Gladwell suddenly discovering that actually maybe men and women's sports was a bad idea, but he didn't discover it. He actually knew it all along, but was afraid to say it before. But now he's brave enough to tell us. And it's a lot easier to be brave enough to tell people when others have stood up to the bullying. And I think that's basically what's happened here with DEI.
Although we hope to get to this place where people like Malcolm Gladwell and others were willing to say what they truly believe. So it's the result of people who are early in their courage that allows people who are less courageous to come to the fore and to help sort of, put a nail in the coffin, right?
Sure, but those early people pay a price, and we should recognize and reward them more for having paid that price and be a little less laudatory towards those who were unwilling to pay a price and free ride off of the courage of others.
Yeah, that's true. I'm still happy that the dynamic is happening, but I agree with you that it doesn't take nearly as much courage today than it did 3-4 years ago. So you've been in, the university education space. You've presumably been training the future teachers of this country. One thing that we talk about at the North American Values Institute is, the problem with sort of teachers' colleges. And we did some research on decolonizing the syllabus and decolonizing education. And literally there was so much evidence of it everywhere that it was even hard to focus on where to point out the problem, and you have this, and decolonizing the curriculum, people think it means something akin to, the British Empire leaving, one of its subjects. And they don't realize what it really means is sort of is sort of purging it of any Western influence, and you have and also politicizing the classroom, basically teaching teachers to turn their students into social justice warriors as they are. Lyle Asher, I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. He's written some pretty extensive essays looking at how how teachers' colleges became a menace to higher education. What is your experience? What is your take on that?
Sure. So I'm actually a little more optimistic on some of these fronts. I mean, I agree with you that ed schools are generally pretty terrible, and the syllabi look terrible. And I think that in elite private institutions and in high wealth suburban communities where they fully embrace the latest fads, you do have real radical indoctrination creeping into classrooms. But it's a big country. And, we have 50 million, almost 50 million K-12 school children with a little more than 3 million public school teachers out there. And the vast majority of them are not radicals and have not imbibed this extremism. Even if they're assigned it in their ed school classes, they don't read it. Actually, I mean, I often doubted that the instructors had ever read Paulo Freire or Dewey. Dewey's almost impenetrable. Anyway, I highly doubt that many of these people have actually read it, even if they've been assigned it. And so that doesn't make them good instructors, and it does make them have a default where they will repeat slogans that they've heard, and that's bad. But they're not deeply committed to an indoctrination project. So in most places in the country, local schools will reflect the values and priorities of local communities if they're allowed to. And one of the problems that we've had in education is the centralization of education, with enormous growth in state education departments and bureaucracies and federal involvement trying to dictate classroom practice in a much more forceful way. And when we do that, we're disconnecting the schools from their local communities and the families that enroll their children in them. And so school choice is really the most positive way to prevent the hijacking of local schools and reconnecting families with education by ensuring that the schools their children attend reflect their priorities.
Yeah. Look, I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and it's a very, very blue area. And I don't think there's been a Republican elected official from Montgomery County for a couple decades. And you see some of these ideological trends. It's not sort of the decolonization stuff that you see in California or Minneapolis or Seattle, where they're, blaming Israel and America for all the world's ills, but it is sort of the DEI school and even white supremacy culture, which holds that, showing up on time is a white supremacy value. And that's a pedagogy that's being taught. I don't know if it's lost some of its steam. I'm going to look into that.
Well, they just lost.
Yeah, they lost a huge Supreme Court case. That is a like I think a $4 billion education system in a pretty wealthy area. I get the sense there that that's not driven by the state of Maryland. It's much more driven by Montgomery County and the politics of Montgomery County, Maryland.
Well, as I was saying, in very high wealth communities like Montgomery County, or in elite private schools, you get the elites of those communities deeply committed to these enterprises, and they're able to hire teachers who are enthusiastic about pursuing these agendas in their classrooms. And so the problem in Montgomery County, as you correctly say, is not a state takeover or a federal takeover. They're pursuing it on their own, but that's because these are high wealth communities where they chase the latest crazy fad. Again, out in the rest of the country, I'm much more hopeful, that the schools will roughly reflect the priorities and values of the communities if they're not centralized in their control. And the most effective form of decentralization is school choice, because it decentralizes the family. And I have a slight concern with the Supreme Court decision in response to Montgomery's abuses of imposing LGBTQ readings on their students. So Montgomery County is not the norm. I think part of the problem is that a lot of policy elites live in these wealthy communities and they extrapolate to the entire country based on them. But the rest of the country is a lot more normal. And if they were left to their own devices, they would reflect the full pluralism of our diverse country.
There was that New York Times expose on the University of Michigan's DEI bureaucracy. And what was memorable about it was that no one liked it at University of Michigan, right? And it wasn't like that they were all, crying bloody murder like we are about the ideological indoctrination. They just thought it was extraneous and ridiculous. And that's why.
Right. I can tell you from the perspective of being a faculty member and listening to my peer faculty, both at the University of Arkansas and colleagues all around the country, they just felt hassled. They don't like meetings. They don't like mandatory trainings. They just don't. They want to be left alone to do their thing. And so they just don't like this kind of stuff for the most part. Now, the general problem is that universities have been hijacked by well-organized, ideologically motivated, but small groups of faculty and students. And they're organized enough and they're threatening enough that they can intimidate a lot of people into advancing their agendas. And they're perfectly willing to destroy their institutions or expose their institutions to significant financial or legal liability. And they don't care because they are pursuing their agendas at the expense of the institution as a whole. And I think a big part of what Trump is doing by standing up to this nonsense is just strengthening the resolve of the people on campus who don't want to be intimidated and threatened by these little terrorists on campus. And that's what it is.
Yeah, if you've ever encountered, and most people have who have been in the workplace for a long time, like a sociopath, narcissist type, these are individuals who engage in a kind of scorched earth with everything that they do. And so what happens is they can accumulate great authority or power within the workplace because no one wants to take them on because they know what's going to happen. And they just don't want to get dirty. As they said, never wrestle with a pig because you'll get dirty and the pig likes it, and I think this is sort of a collective phenomena of similar weight. If you get enough people who behave that way, they practice this sort of scorched earth policy in the workplace or at the university or wherever. The average soccer mom or dad, which is everybody else, just simply doesn't want to get dirty at all, and they then fold.
I think that's right. Although, I think we should be aware that it's a larger percentage of academia than of other institutions because academia attracts more crazy people. They're drawn to it because they think they can do more to pursue their agendas there. And also, it's harder in the for-profit world than the nonprofit world because there is some accountability for results that matters. And in the nonprofit world, it's a lot harder to figure out what accountability for result looks like. And so it's easier to hijack the institution for private agendas. So I think we're making a lot of progress, even more progress in the corporate world at combating DEI than in the university world, but we're making a lot of progress there. But that's not exactly the same thing as making progress for ideological diversity. While it's relatively easy to dismantle these bureaucracies that hassle and intimidate people, it's not so easy to get faculty who've been selected over time for increasing ideological fervor to suddenly decide that it's really great for them to hire people who they hate, or to admit as graduate students people they hate, or to accept papers to journals from people they hate. And they hate a lot of people. openness to ideas.
I asked Michael Polyakov. I don't know if you know him. Yeah, and I said Michael was talking about this problem on a previous podcast with me, and we started talking. I said, Michael, it sounds like you're advocating for a kind of ideological affirmative action here, and he
I'm not saying that.
But I'm wondering though, if that's what's necessary. I mean, if you have to say, look, guys, you've been at 97% left wing, in order to restore the institution to some normalcy where there's ideological diversity, you need to get to 10%. I mean, this is, is that not reasonable?
I think that's not the solution. The solution is competition and choice.
And then you do that by creating new universities.
And an important part of making universities feel competitive pressure is to starve them of money. So they're awash in way, way too much money. You wouldn't believe how rich universities are. And if you don't believe, I know if you listen to them, they'll tell you how poor they are and how expensive and important what they do is. But if all you have to do to realize how stinking rich universities are is walk around their campuses. They're like the Palace of Versailles. I mean, they're the most gorgeous grounds you've ever seen in your life. And they're able to afford all of that because they're stinking rich. And so we need in general to cut back on government subsidy for higher education. The sector is way overbuilt and way oversubsidized, and rich people have to stop giving. Even moderately rich people have to really stop giving because what universities sell is essentially a fountain of youth. A transportation back to when you were a sophomore, and you can imagine it when you write the check for your alumni fund. But the place isn't like you remember it. It's not the same place that you went to, and you don't get to be a sophomore again by writing that check. So instead, try to look forward and write a check to new institutions, not just University of Austin, but we need to start a whole bunch of new institutions that will compete and offer a variety of ideological perspectives, pedagogical practices. And through that choice and competition, we're going to have a much healthier higher education landscape.
But isn't the line of argument you're making, and then I made as well, isn't that what sort of allowed the sort of whole woke moment to emerge? Like, we just thought, okay, all this stuff is sort of on the fringes, and it's a bunch of crazy teachers. And before you know it, it gained tremendous cultural currency and shut down everybody else. So how do we make sense of that?
I agree. And I made that mistake. I confess that I went around saying, well, this is nonsense that people indulge when they're in college, and then they go to work and they become responsible adults and they forget it. But as it turns out, that wasn't true. They were actually bringing it into the workplace and continuing their irresponsible adolescence well into adulthood. And so I could be wrong here, but there are a few other reasons for optimism, which is that a higher percentage of teachers are coming through alternative paths. That is, they don't come through ed schools. They receive alternative certification, often administered by the state. Now, as it turns out, the state often contracts with ed schools to provide some of those courses. So their ed schools are still getting their hands on those students a little bit. But it's an increasing percentage of people not coming through ed schools who still work in classrooms. I think that the fact that we have increasing non-traditional certification shows that the dissatisfaction with ed schools is widespread. And the political class in most states sees this problem, and they're providing ways for people to become teachers without being indoctrinated. Now, the question, why do universities tolerate ed schools? They're embarrassing, frankly, for most universities, because they're not filled with respectable scholars, and they are filled with people who will bring nonsense into administration. So why do universities tolerate them? They tolerate them because they're cash cows. They're incredibly profitable. They don't have any expensive labs. The faculty are cheap, and they have a captured clientele of people who need to be certified or want a master's so that they can get a pay bump and are willing to just pay to get a nonsense master's simply because they get an automatic pay increase. If states were to abolish the master's pay bump, so this is in the salary schedule for teachers, they receive an automatic pay increase for the rest of their career if they earn a master's degree. If we get rid of that, there's a lot less demand for ed school classes because many fewer people will want to get a master's at ed schools. Ed schools will become much less profitable. And then universities may decide, you know what, we don't have to have this. We can get rid of it. It's not such a moneymaker.
Is that a heritage agenda item, by the way?
I don't. It hasn't been adopted as an official agenda item, but it is something that we've talked about for sure.
Fascinating, by the way. I confess I have not heard that argument, that idea.
Yeah, abolish the pay bump for masters, and you take away the profitability of ed schools. If you take away the profitability of ed schools, a lot of universities will decide they don't need to have it.
Wow. That's crazy. That's a crazy good idea. Okay. Well, you just left me with a political agenda. I'm going to bring it to the policy council and have a discussion. That's great. What a thought. All right. Well, this has been fascinating, as I knew it would be. And you always bring some, I like your intellectual honesty as well. It's not, you're not one of these people who peddles pessimism all the time. You believe that there are opportunities there, and I always value your perspective. So Jay, thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing working with you. And I may, who knows, come back to you on this whole pay bump idea.
Look, I have a lot of fun talking with you. I've enjoyed being on your podcast in the past. Would love to again in the future. And you have a great audience who are the kinds of people who I hope can hear these ideas and push back. I mean, I think both you and I agree that part of how we make progress is through healthy debate and skepticism. And that involves throwing out ideas for people to consider. And you don't have to be convinced now, but maybe you'll be convinced later.
Exactly. Or we'll be convinced, but still it's an important process. Awesome. Great. Well, great to talk to you. Be well.